Well, Juan was on his bicycle, and he had 2 bags of sand, and he came to the border crossing. And the border patrol stopped him and said, "Okay, what's in the bags?" And he said, "Well, it's sand." He said, "Well, where are you going?" He said, "I'm going across the border." And he said, "Well, I need to look at it." So he takes the sand and he dumps it out, and it's just sand. And the border patrol didn't believe him, so he retained him, and he sent the sand out to be tested, and it came back, and it was sand. So he put the sand back in the bags and sent him on his way. Well, a week later, he showed up again on his bicycle with 2 bags of sand. And again, the Border Patrol checked the sand, and again it was sand, and he sent him on the way. Well, this happened every week for 3 years. Juan would come through the border crossing with 2 bags of sand on his bicycle. Well, finally, one day he didn't show up, and the Border Patrol guard was at the cantina and having a beer, and Juan comes in and orders a beer, and finally he goes over to him and he says, he says, "I know that you've been smuggling something across the border, and I cannot figure out what it is. Just between you and me, what is it?" Well, Juan takes a sip of his beer and thinks for a moment, and he says, "Bicycles." Life is a mystery to be explored and discovered. This past week I started another remodeling project, and I was in the basement and I was tearing the walls off on the outer walls, and underneath the old insulation there was these newspapers that were folded up and kind of tucked in there to kind of block the air flowing in the walls. And so I pulled one of them, carefully pulled one of them out, and it was in really good shape, and I opened it up, and it was a February 26th, 1956 edition of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. And so, I opened, the front page was there, and it was, there was a picture on it, and the headlines were "Tornado Destroys Whatever," and then the big picture, and there's this golden retriever sitting in the midst of all this rubble of a destroyed home. And the story was about this golden retriever wouldn't leave. He was waiting for his master to return. And the sad part, of course, is the master had perished in the rubble in the storm. And so, you just feel that kind of for a moment. This is 1956, not today. And yet, in the story below it, a woman had embezzled from her employer over a period of 28 years, $2.8 million. And which is like $30 million today, over a period of 28 years. And so I thought, well, then in the sports section, it was about the Husky basketball team, and it had a little article about, and I thought, this paper, other than the ads, this paper could have been written today, or could have been written in this time. I mean, the stories, the whole thing, the context, everything. And it's interesting that what occurred to me is that not that much has changed in the human condition in the last 53 years, or the last 153 years, or the last 2,053 years. Not much has changed in the way in which life shows up, and the challenges and the issues and the tragedies and the circumstances and all the things that occur because we live in these human bodies. And I think when Jesus said the poor will always be among you, he was not just talking about those who are poor in terms of their financial circumstances. He was also talking, I believe, about those who are poor in the context of their understanding of their relationship to God or to Spirit or to whatever it is that, however we want to say that or express it. And so in a sense it might be thought of as spiritual poverty, although we all have an equal share of spirit in us, so we can't have spiritual poverty, but we can have a disconnect from it. We cannot be aware of it, or we can be sort of separate from it. So in a sense, that's what's showing up in the human struggle. And so when we are not aware of life as a spiritual journey, when we have that disconnect in the human struggle then becomes problems to be solved rather than a mystery to be experienced. Because when we are on a spiritual journey, life is a mystery. It's an unfolding process of what it is that we are here to experience and bring forth and have in our life. And I think the essential ingredient is knowing, and that results in doing. So what it is that we know results in what it is that we do and how that shows up in our life. And so today we're going to look at the what and the why in terms of our spiritual journey. And over the next 7 weeks, we're going to be following Michael Beckwith's book, as I mentioned earlier, Spiritual Liberation, Fulfilling Your Soul's Potential. Now, Michael Beckwith is the senior minister of the Agape Church in Santa Monica, California, which is a huge New Thought church, but he was also one of the featured people on the movie The Secret, and so he has a certain kind of charisma and energy and depth and in terms of what he has done and shared and experienced in his life. And so we're going to be kind of following his journey through this awakening to spirit and the unfoldment of spirit. He says in the introduction of the book, he says, our inner spirit is the most vibrantly real and ecstatic aspect of our being. It's puzzling that we have to be educated to how to be spiritually awakened, how to activate our soul potential, especially when considering that enlightenment is inherent within us. And what I think he's really saying is that enlightenment isn't about what's going on out here. It's not what shows up in the world. Enlightenment is a function of what is internally within our own soul and our own spirit. And so when we awaken to that, it's puzzling to him that why we have to be educated to that reality. That it should be just a normal sort of unfoldment of the discovery of the mystery of our being and who it is that we are and how we express that in our world. Enlightenment, in my mind, is the full realization of our God self and our God potential in the world. Emily Cady, in Lessons in Truth, which is a book that was written well over 100 years ago and could have been just as easily written today, because the truth is the truth, whether it's 1900 or whether it's 2009, the truth is the truth and always resonates at that level. Emily Cady said that she referred to it as spiritual understanding, that enlightenment from her context is spiritual understanding. She says, understanding is a spiritual birth, a revelation of God within the human soul. And this revelation of truth to the consciousness of a person is spiritual understanding. Now, it's not intellectual. Even though the awakened intellect is a step. Certainly learning principles and learning spiritual law and learning some of the theological sort of dynamics doesn't hurt us. It can be helpful in terms of our journey, but it is not the awakening. It is not what it is that we are seeking, because it's something much beyond simply mental gymnastics that goes with learning something. Emily Cady said that all of Jesus' teachings are there to lead us higher in consciousness, that the purpose is to lift us in terms of a higher sense of awareness of who it is that we are, and that in order for him to get that message across, he had to begin with the external world. And sometimes it is our behaviors that help us to discover what is truly within us. That if we seek to change how it is that we show up in the world, that change that we are seeking to make, or that correction or that dynamic that we're trying to bring into our life, helps us to understand that Spirit of God within us. Because we see the results of some of the things that we do. He said, love your enemies and do good to those who persecute you. Well, that's an action that we can take. That's a specific thing. Whether we feel it or not, we can do that. We can do good to those who do not do good to us. We can show up in that way even if we do not feel it here. And as we do that and see the results of that, we begin to move more closely into the awareness of the awakened spiritual self. And that brings us forth. And that's what Jesus, I think, was trying to do, is to help demonstrate that, to open people up, and to know that we are governed by spiritual law, but we are also governed by love.